Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we have two special guests, Dr. Ryan Mullins and Dr. Rob Koons. We're going to be discussing the compatibility of divine simplicity and Trinitarianism, or perhaps lack thereof if you're Ryan Mullins. But anyway, we're also going to be focusing specially on Dr. Rob Koons' proposal of the divine persons as relational qua-objects. And so we're kind of going to be focusing on that in particular. And you can check the link in the description. I have a link to his paper and other papers of Ryan Mullins on this topic as well. Without further ado, I think we can turn it over to Ryan to just define some preliminaries. Things like we're going to start with divine simplicity. So, Ryan, can you take us through divine simplicity, and then we'll turn it over to Rob for his understanding of divine simplicity.
Mm-hmm. So, as I understand it, the doctrine of divine simplicity says that there's no metaphysical or physical composition in God, such that there's no distinction in God between things like substance and attributes, essence and existence, form, matter, act, potency, genus, differentia, agent, action, and essence or accident. And it's also the case that all of God's intrinsic features are identical not only to each other, but to God himself. And so the claim is sometimes things like this. You'll see people say that God does not have any properties, potential, forms, accidents, etc. And then according to thinkers like Anselm, not even conceptual distinctions apply to God. And Anselm makes this claim on several occasions. And as the medieval scholar Robert Pasnall explains, the denial of conceptual distinctions, it's really important for Anselm's argument from simplicity to timelessness. So as I see it, the doctrine of simplicity is very strong.
Good. So, yeah, I think, I guess my conception of it is somewhat different. And I think part of the thing that makes it difficult is that there's a kind of background theory of properties that you have to operate with in order to make sense of it. So, for instance, if you were an ostrich nominalist, right, you just thought they're just things, and then we say things about things, then it would be really hard to distinguish strong simplicity from weak simplicity, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, God would just be simply have no parts, but there'd be all kinds of things we could say about him, and that would be the end of it. So, traditionally, the doctrine of divine simplicity was developed within an Aristotelian framework. And so there was a kind of Aristotelian background theory that was operating there. And so I think makes the discussion somewhat complicated if you're dealing with someone who isn't Aristotelian, right? And who comes at that doctrine and tries to make sense of it. So for me, I would put the doctrine primarily this way, that God has a nature, but that he's identical to that nature. So he has it in a unique way by being that nature. And then he has no accidents. That is, there are no accidents that inhere in him. And then the further, even stronger claim is that he's actually identical to his own existence, his own active existence. So those are the sort of three, to me, central ideas. Now, you obviously for our discussion, a big issue is going to be this question of features of God or properties of God. I mean, the word property and feature, actually, both of them are not terms that you really find in that Aristotelian tradition. They don't really map onto that tradition particularly well. So it gets to be complicated here, as to say, in asking, well, does God have distinct properties? I want to say yes and no, right? That is, if we understand by property, this is really, I think, your Anselm point. If we understand a property, something that can be predicated of God truly, then certainly he has many properties, and those things as predicables are not identical to each other. And so there is a distinctness there. But at the level of truth maker, you might say, if we can use that language, that is, what is it that in God that makes it true that he has these different predicates? I don't want to say there's just the one thing, that is God himself, his nature. There's no metaphysical complexity there, as there is in all creatures, right? So for all creatures, there is both the essence and various accidents. There is a distinction between the essence and the active existence of creatures. So there's a lot of metaphysical complexity in creatures on my picture, and God lacks that sort of metaphysical complexity. As it'll turn out, I mean, there certainly are properties of God that are distinct from each other. I mean, for instance, disjunctive properties, right? God is omnipotent or a lemon, let's say, if that's true of God. That's not identical, I think, to any of his ordinary attributes, right? God is not a bat, right? That's true of God also. It's distinct from all kinds of properties, so negative properties. Things that are sort of logically and semantically derivable from God's basic properties, those could well be multiple in my picture. So maybe my view is somewhat weaker than Anselm's. I don't actually know the details of Anselm's view here, but I do think there are conceptual distinctions here that are relevant to God.
So I got a quick question for you, though. So Catherine Rogers points out that it's not just the Aristotelian framework that's being done here, because you've got someone like, well, St. Augustine, for instance, who's broadly like Neoplatonic. And so she's saying like the doctrine is just not dependent upon Aristotelianism, because then you would cut out all sorts of major medieval thinkers from affirming the doctrine. So I'm just kind of curious what you think about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I guess maybe I should back off a little bit and say not necessarily Aristotelian, but what Ed Feser now calls the Platonic tradition. So I personally think that Neoplatonists are not that far from Aristotle. Actually, they were building on Aristotle as well. They didn't see themselves as Platonists, but not Aristotelians. And likewise, in Augustine, you find a lot of Aristotelian elements that have come to him indirectly as well. So, I mean, I haven't really thought that much about what divine simplicity looks like from a Platonistic point of view. But I assume that you would want to say that that God does not instantiate universals that are distinct from himself. And so you get something, and so he wouldn't, and if you were an eminent Platonist, you wouldn't want to have God have various universals inside himself. That would be contrary to the doctrine as well. So yeah, I think you could make some accommodation here to the Platonists and include them in the doctrine.
Because that's why you're going to see someone like Mike Bergman and Jeff Brower say like simplicity is incompatible with universals, with tropes, with forms, with immanent universals, with any sort of exemplifiables of any sort, because they're trying to fit it into all the different broad like metaphysical frameworks that it's been found in throughout history. Right.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So then the second question I want to get onto is, what is a person? And so I think this is like a really important thing to discuss for the Trinity, because otherwise I don't know how to distinguish orthodoxy from heresy. So someone like Jaroslav Pelikan and John of Damascus, like they say that orthodoxy is not about just simply uttering the right kind of slogans or phrases, because like what really matters is like the underlying metaphysical claims. And so the Emperor Justinian, who's like presides over the Fifth Ecumenical Council, like he points out that lots of Nestorians, they were affirming the right slogans, but Justinian's like, that's not enough. You got to tell me what the actual metaphysical story is here. Because Nestorians, he says, like they're saying like, Christ is one person with two natures, but he's like, your view actually entails there are two people here. So you got to give me some real metaphysical things going on here. So what I want to say is that a person is just like a center of consciousness with a will. Or something like a person is like a thing with a first person perspective. And so if I'm going to look at the Trinity, then I want to say that, well, there's going to be three centers of consciousness, each with their own will. But I do want to concede, though, in the particular point here before turning it over to you, is that the Council of Nicaea and Constantinople, they do not define what a person is, and nor does the later Council of Chalcedon. And in fact, like these councils didn't define a lot of things, which is what leads to all these other later controversies. So, but however, though, given that, people like Khalid Anatolios, Thomas McCall, and William Hasker, like they say that there's really good reason to think that something like this conception of a person that they just laid out, it's not foreign to various pro-Nicene theologians like the Cappadocians or Augustine. And getting a Cappadocian like Gregory Nazianzus on your side, like that's really important because he was the one who was presiding over the Council of Constantinople in 381, which is where we get the Nicene Creed, which is what we're going to talk about quite a bit today. So I think there's some good historical basis for this sort of view. But yeah, so now it's just what do you think about person, what a person is?
Yeah, no, I think we're pretty close on this, really. I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by a center of consciousness. Does that contrast with a periphery of consciousness or something? But
it's just language that people use, subject, subject. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Something that thinks and wills and loves and so on. Yeah, and I think the first person perspective, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with that too. Although I mean, obviously there's some complexity here because God doesn't think in language, and so there's nothing literally first personal in the sense of pronoun I in the divine thoughts. But but there's something analogous to it, I think, right? And as far as like we can make sense of the Trinity, I do think we think of it as though when the Father thinks I, and he thinks you of the Son, right? There's some sort of distinction there. So I think I agree with that. And likewise, you said a person is a thing, and if thing is understood in the broadest possible sense,
Sure.
then I'm fine with that, I think.
Yeah, because I want to try to be as broad as possible. Because like Boethius is like it's substance of a rational nature, and then he tries to apply that to Trinity, and you're like, well, hang on, but you need three substances if you're three persons. So I want to try to be as generous as I can and be like, let's not make a mistake like that.
Right. Exactly. Mm-hmm. I mean, one other thing I might comment here is that, as you say, that they don't define person, but actually, as I understand it, the theologians here are the first ones to use person, at least in Latin, as a technical term of any kind. And so it's not as though, I mean, nowadays we philosophers use person a lot, right? We sort of think of it as a common coin, but by the time this was an innovative idea, and much of what we now think of as personhood really derives from the Trinity. So the three persons of the Trinity are sort of paradigms of persons, and you and I are persons in a kind of derived sense, historically speaking. Yeah.
So then, Joe, should we go on to the question about like what is the Trinity?
Yeah, definitely. So conciliar Trinitarianism has a variety of like core commitments, like the processions, the distinctions among the persons and so on. So I'll turn over to Ryan to sort of spell out how he understands the sort of core conciliar Trinitarianism.
Right. Okay. So as I see it, there's this basic framework of the doctrine of the Trinity that's enshrined in what we call the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed of 381. And then today we just typically call it the Nicene Creed. So this is called an ecumenical creed because it's produced by 2 of the 7 ecumenical councils. There's like other creeds like the Athanasian Creed and the Apostles' Creed, but they're not produced by ecumenical councils. So they don't have the same like sort of authority or the same like kind of like binding on different Christians who want to affirm like the ecumenical councils. The first draft of the Nicene Creed was developed at the Council of Nicaea in 325, but they kind of forgot to mention the Holy Spirit. So they're like, ooh, okay, let's make sure we get him in the next one. And so in the final draft, like this is where theologians are always forgetting the Holy Spirit. So this is it's nothing new. So they get him in the final draft though, and so the final draft it's articulated in the Council of Constantinople in 381. And what I've got here is what I take to be 5 standard Trinitarian claims from the Council of Nicaea. And these are pretty standard textbook ones, and they call them T1 through T5. So T1, there are 3 divine persons. T2, the divine persons are not numerically identical to each other. T3 is what's called the homoousios doctrine, and so it's typically stated as the divine persons share the divine essence. T4 is monotheism, so it's the divine persons are related in such a way that there's just only one God and not 3 gods. And then there's this thing called T5 is the doctrine of processions, which is that the divine persons are distinguished and related by causal relations. So, for example, the Father causes the Son to exist, and then the Father causes the Spirit to exist, or maybe the Father and Son cause the Spirit to exist together. And so these 5 Trinitarian desiderata, they're affirmed by subsequent theologians like Augustine, Aquinas, but there's been some controversy in the 20th and 21st century over the doctrine of processions, because some people think it just entails subordinationism or Arianism. And then some people also argue it's just unbiblical, and they're in whatever traditions they're in within Christianity, they think the Bible has more authority than something like the Nicene Creed. So they'll say, I'm not really affirming exactly what the Nicene Creed says, but I can affirm something in the neighborhood. But I'm also affirming something that's more biblical.
Yeah. So I'm fine with all that, although I want to qualify this 0.5.
Okay.
See in the notes. So, I mean, what the creeds tell us is that the Father begets the Son, and that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Nothing there explicitly says that that's a causal relation, right? That the Father causes the Son to exist. And that I would object to on both philosophical and theological grounds, that it really would amount to a kind of Arianism. I mean, maybe not strict Arianism, because it would involve a kind of eternal causation, I suppose, right? So there's not a time in which the Son isn't. So it escapes Arianism by the skin of its teeth, so to speak. But as far as from a philosophical point of view, it looks awfully Arian to me, because it means that the Son is a kind of eternal creature of the Father, and likewise the Spirit. And that strikes me as suggesting that they couldn't really, there's a tension between that and the idea of three, that they all have the divine essence, because God's essence is one of being uncaused, right? Of being having aseity and so on. So that's why on my own account, I try to capture a kind of priority of the Father over the Son and the Spirit that isn't causal, at least not causal in the way in which you put it in 5, that is causing the Son to exist. That I think that's a bridge too far in my view. I mean, there's some kind of causal relation between the two, but not one of the Son's existence depending on the Father's will, let's say.
Yeah, so I'm going to push back on this, because the fact that this is a causal relation, I mean, this is very explicit in the Creed. So, and this is pointed out by church historians like Kevin Giles, Michelle Barnes, Stephen Holmes, Christopher Bealey. And then it's also acknowledged by philosophical theologians like Richard Cross, Paul Helm, William Hasker, William Lane Craig, J.T. Pash. So like I don't really think this is up for debate. So like let me explain a little bit what's going on here. So the Nicene Creed says the Son is begotten, like you pointed out, and that he's not made. But the word begotten here is genetos in the Greek, which has 2 N's, whereas the word created is genetos with just 1 N. So it's just a single, which is really annoying and caused a lot of confusion in the early church. So the early church scholar Alistair Heron, he says, like, when we're looking at these words, they have a particular meaning. And so he says the word begotten in the Creed means, this is a direct quote from Heron, that which has a cause or source outside itself. And then when he comes to the term created, which is genetos with just 1 N, he says it means, quote, that which has come into being. And then a church historian like Stephen Holmes says the creedal teaching is, quote, the Father is the personal cause of the Son, and because of this, they are able to share the same nature. So I do not think that this is up for like debate on this issue. I think this is very clearly the ecumenical teaching, and I can give you lots of other quotes too from people like Gregor of Nazianzus, who was the president of the council, and Gregor of Nyssa, who say the Father is uncaused, and the Son is caused, and the Holy Spirit is caused. So the word genetos quite literally means but you're right though, it is an eternal cause though, and so that's and it misses Arianism by the skin of its teeth. So the created means caused, but you have a beginning to your existence, whereas begotten is caused, but you're eternally caused, such that you eternally exist and you eternally share in the divine nature somehow.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so as I said towards the end, I mean, the notion of causation itself is something that we'd have to think about a bit. So there's, I mean, the modern conception of causation, let's say that you get from, after Hume anyway, is one that I think you couldn't read back into the creeds, right? Would you agree with that? Because that really would require a kind of production of the Son by the Father.
Oh, actually, I should take that back. I'm sorry. J.T. Pash's book on the medieval doctrine of eternal generation, it's really clear that it is production. It's productive. And Michelle Barnes says the same thing about the Arian understanding and the Orthodox understanding, the Cappadocian understanding of generation. It is productive.
Okay. Right.
So
I'll have to check on that. I mean, I don't have the same kind of degree of scholarship there that you have, but I mean, my own conception here of it is that there's a kind of causal relation, certainly between the Father and the Son and the Spirit. It's the kind of causal priority that you have of an agent over a patient, so to speak. Right. So God is the knower. The Son is the one who's known, who's the object of that act of intentionality. So my own view is that I've captured that element adequately, but yeah, I can see that that's going to be an issue.
Sure. Yeah.
So we can definitely work with Rob's sort of understanding of this sort of relation between the divine persons going forward. So the next thing on the outline is basically allowing Rob to spell out basically his account of relational qua-objects, or the divine persons as relational qua-objects. And so, Rob, can you give us in the audience a sort of a characterization of what precisely a qua-object is, and then how you understand it in the context of Trinitarianism?
Right. So when things have properties or characteristics, we can talk meaningfully about that thing qua that characteristic, right? So President Trump is both president, and he's a father, he's a husband, and hotel owner, let's say, right? So we can sort of distinguish between Trump qua father, Trump qua president, Trump qua hotel owner, right? And there are certain actions that you can easily assign to one of those or the other. That he tells Barron something and tells him to go to bed. That's Trump qua father. He sells some space on his hotel to a golf tournament. That's Trump qua hotel owner, and so on. And so these things, there's been quite a bit of work in recent philosophy on these things, starting with Kit Fine, and then one of my former colleagues, Nicholas Asher, has done some work on this as well, for working out the semantics and the logic of this sort of notion. So that's an idea. So my thought was, well, maybe I should back up and talk a little bit about God to begin with. So on my view, God has a simple nature, but the nature is relational in character. That is, God is, as the epistle goes, as the Apostle John puts it, God is love, and love is a relation, and he's also knowledge. And of course, as a believer in divine simplicity, I think his knowledge and his love are the same thing. But in both cases, to understand God's nature, you have to understand him relationally. I'm also influenced here by Aristotle, I think in the Metaphysics, where he says God is self-thinking thought, that he's an act of thinking whose object is itself, right? And I think that's really the essence of God. That is, God is an act of love and of knowledge, whose object, primary object, principal object, is himself. And so even though he has a simple nature, because that nature is relational, so it's actually a binary relation, a non-symmetric binary relation. There's a distinction between the two relata, that is, being the knower and being the one known, being the lover and being the one beloved. And so I argue that you can then, and of course this gets back to our earlier question about whether that's consistent with divine simplicity. And I want to say, well, yeah, because these are not accidents of God. These are not two distinct accidents of God. These are just two different predicables of God that derive logically from the fact that he has a simple relational nature. So God is the knower of God, and he is also the one known perfectly by God as God. And so that, I argue, gives rise to really three distinct qua-objects here. God qua knower of God, God qua known by God as God, and then the conjunction of those two, God qua knower and known simultaneously. And so this is this point, of course, it's conjecture. It's just I'm not really, I'm not proposing this as a new creed, or I don't have a great deal of confidence in this, but it struck me as, interesting at least to try lining this up with as a model of the Trinity, and suggest that we can identify God the Father was God qua knower, the Son God qua known, and the Spirit as the conjunction as God qua knower and known. And then I've tried to work out some theories about how, well, mostly by relying on, again, my work on Fine and Asher in the ordinary case, as to how this would work in terms of predications. So all three persons share the nature of God, in the sense that all of the, you might say, simple predications we would make of God, that he's omnipotent, all-powerful, good, eternal, uncaused, and so on, these would all be true of each of the persons, right? Just as, these certain features of Trump are going to be true for him as hotel owner and as president, that he's alive, that he's conscious, and so on. Those are going to be true on all three, on all the different qua-objects. So, and similarly, all three persons are involved are the agents of all divine actions. So the Father creates, the Son creates, and the Holy Spirit creates. All those kinds of properties will also be true of each of the three persons. But then there will be other properties which are predicable of the persons and not of the Godhead per se. So, for instance, being a qua-object, right? That's something that's true of each of the three persons, but not of God simpliciter, right? Because God simpliciter is not a qua-object. then, of course, there's an interesting question here, which is, well, wait a minute. I mean, surely knowing things is something that God does, right? So God the Son must know as well as be known. And so how then can I really distinguish the three? And I want to say, well, in that case, he's going to know in the way in which God as known knows, right? So the action itself becomes qualified as well. So you not only have the subject of the predicate qualified, God qua known, right? The verb becomes qualified as well, knows qua God as known, right? So, and then whatever, knows God or knows the Spirit or whatever object you want to put in there. So you get multiple qualifications here, whereas the God the Father knows, but he doesn't know as God the Son, right? He knows in his own distinct fatherly way, right? Qua knower and not qua known. So I think that I can get that sort of distinction working, and going back to the 5 points. I mean, there are certainly 3 distinct persons here on this picture. The qua-objects are numerically distinct. There are things true of one and not of the other. So from a Leibnizian point of view, there are 3 distinct persons. So that gets us 1 and 2. And I sort of explain in the paper some why, and this I think is a kind of nice feature. I argue there's a reason to think there'd be just 3 persons. You couldn't have more. Because anything else any other sort of qualifications you would try to introduce would be reducible to one of these 3. Ultimately, we can go into the details if you're interested in that. They're all 3 share the divine essence because they're all, qua-objects are grounded in something. There's a basis of the qua-object, right? In this case, the basis of all 3 persons is the divine nature, God itself. And so it has, in the strictest possible sense, they are all divine. They all have the divine nature, and they relate to each other in such a way. Well, and of course, there's only one God here. I think that's a big advantage of mine. There aren't 3 instances of the divine nature, right? There's only one instance. Ryan mentioned briefly the Athanasian Creed, the 6th century Volt creed, which isn't quite as right. It's not as normative as the Nicene Creed, but for Catholics, Lutherans, Anglicans, and Reformed Christians, it is authoritative. And that one pretty clearly says there are not 3 instances of the divine nature. There are not 3 omnipotent beings, but 1 omnipotent being. Not 3 omniscient beings, but 1 omniscient being. Not 3, and so on. And so I think I capture that in my picture because the nature has a single instance. And then the thing that I think is going to divide us is how to understand these causal relations. Because, of course, on my picture, it's not going to be the case, really, that, the existence sort of flows from the Father to the Son, I think. Although I do think there's some sense in which you can give a kind of causal priority to the Father here, right? Because it's the knowing that gives rise to the being known, right? And so the Father is causally prior to the Son in a relevant sense. So I guess that's a bare sketch of the view.
Yeah. And as always, there's like much more flesh that can be put on it, and it'll be refined by further questioning and discussion, and you go into a lot of that in the paper. But Ryan, I think we can turn it over to you, and now we're kind of just going to go back and forth on different sort of maybe worries that might be raised towards this account. And so I think we're probably going to start with the first one, which is qua-objects as real objects. But it's really up to you, Ryan. So I'll turn over to you, Ryan, and then we'll probably go back and forth, and then we'll see where the spirit takes us, as it were, and we'll go. We'll find the natural stopping point to move on to the second problem and other problems that might arise. So I'll turn it over to you, Ryan.
Right. Good. So yeah. So I'm hoping that some of these questions we got here will help give Rob a chance to explain some of this stuff more. So like one of the big questions I've got here is just like, in what sense are these qua-objects like real objects? Because it seems like prima facie, it seems like they're not real objects. So like in Aristotelian terms, these qua-objects, they're often discussed in terms of what's called accidental sameness. And these are, there's only one real object, which is like the substance and its properties. But yet you can conceptually divide this object up into these multiple qua-objects. But these qua-objects do not have extra mental existence. Like the thing that has like the extra mental existence is the substance with its properties. And so this kind of raises, I guess, two sort of worries in my mind. So first, qua-objects, so the whole idea, I guess, qua-language, it seems to apply to things with structure or intrinsic features, like a substance and accidents. So like the example of like Trump qua hotel owner, Trump qua president. But like a simple God does not have any structure or intrinsic features, so there doesn't seem to be anything to ground the qua language about a simple God. And then the second worry that I have is that qua language involves making conceptual distinctions. And then as I mentioned before, like Anselm on many occasions, and then others like Gregor of Nyssa, Avicenna, Descartes, and so on, they're gonna go with the same claim here from Anselm that not even conceptual distinctions are appropriate to God. They're foreign to God. So it seems like using qua language here to speak of the simple God, it's off to a very rough start if it's going to help us be consistent with simplicity.
Yeah. So this again goes back to the how exactly one understands define simplicity. So I think it doesn't require, my view doesn't require distinct accidents in God. So for instance, I would contrast my view with something like the Jeff Brower, Mike Ray view, in which there are three sorts of relations in God of paternity or extra properties, paternity, and I forget what the other one is, plurality or something like that. But yeah. In any case, there's some sort of three properties or three relations in God. And then that gives rise, I mean, we've sort of identified the persons with each of those three relations. And that I think would be clearly incompatible with divine simplicity, right? Because you have three entities there. On my view, there's just the one nature, no accidents, but it's a relational nature. So that gives rise to properties in the broader sense, predicables, right? Of, being the knower, being known, and so on. And so I think that's enough to give us distinct qua-objects. All you need are predicables of some kind. Now, I think you're right that the distinction is a kind of conceptual or intentional distinction here. But I think that's all right, because it's not a distinction that we're imposing upon God. It's a distinction in the divine intellect itself. That is, the divine intellect knows itself as knower, as known, as both knower and known. So the intentional or conceptual distinctions reside within God's own thought, so to speak. And that's what makes it possible for us to think about these things as distinct, real, distinct entities.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm following this last point because I find it interesting. So the qua distinctions, these are conceptual distinctions, but they're going to be mind dependent in some sense, but it's the divine mind that's making them. That's right. The claim? That's
the idea. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is where I think the modalist fallacy, right, is a view that says that there's just the one God, but that he relates to us in three different ways, right? As for instance, creator, redeemer, and so on. Or I think it would be equally modalistic if we said there's just the one being, but we conceive of him in three different ways, right? So that some kind of human distinction is being imposed upon. That would just be modalism.
Right.
But if the distinction is already there in God himself, right, the conceptual distinction, so doesn't depend on creatures conceiving of him in different ways, but rather God himself in that way conceiving of himself in these three different ways, and thereby giving rise to three different first-person perspectives. That I think is adequate.
Okay, so I guess I've just got to, before we move on to the next big question, I just one more follow up on this. So it's a conceptual distinction that God makes, but God's thoughts are identical to himself, and somehow I'm supposed to get the thing that he makes, this distinction that he makes that's identical to himself, and then I get these three sinners or these three perspectives. Do you see why I'm kind of just a bit confused?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, as it's described in the paper, there's a notion of identity here, the lack of real distinction is the way I put it. And, any two qua-objects are identical with each other in that sense. But it's a weaker sense than it's not strict identity in the Leibnizian sense, right? Of having exactly the same predicates, true of them. So yeah, the divine simplicity, I think, only requires that there be that there be only one thing, in the sense that any divine thing is not really distinct from God. So it's a kind of again, a kind of, as you say, a kind of conceptual distinction, we could say, of the three persons from God. But it's, again, an eternal, necessary, and self-generating kind of distinction.
Okay, cool. So yeah, Joe, did you have anything to add before we go on to the next?
Well, before we move on to your next question, I did want to just maybe briefly touch on how we are understanding these as sort of like real extramental existences, because we might have certain like intuitions. Like when I think of, I just have this intuition, like maybe it's just a brute intuition, maybe I have to like get rid of it when it comes to God or something like that, I don't know, but I have this intuition that qua-objects just it seems as though they're almost like reducible to substances and the way those substances are or act. So like when I think of like Obama qua father and Obama qua president, like it's really hard for me to see how this has any sort of ontological or metaphysical oomph to it, as it were, as sort of extramental, distinct things in reality, as opposed to being reducible to just Obama. And just in different contexts, he acts different ways and assumes different roles and things like that. Like, he'll assume different roles in a context with his daughters, and he'll assume a different role in different contexts as president in the presidency. So maybe you can just at least touch on why we might think that these are sort of extramental existences, as opposed to like just reducible to substances and the contexts and roles in which they find themselves.
Yeah. So I think that you're running together what I would think of as two separate questions here. The question of whether there's an extramental, as you say, reality here, and whether it's reducible. Because I actually do think that the three persons are, in a sense, reducible to the one divine nature and the way that nature is. So the three persons are not metaphysically fundamental, in my view. They are in the category of derivable, but there are lots of derivable entities that are really there, right? That are independent, certainly of my thinking about them or my knowing anything about them or our collectively knowing anything about them. And that's my view here, is that the three persons are distinct from each other. There's three distinct derived beings. They exist independently, certainly of human thought. Now, do they exist independently of divine thought? Well, I mean, it's hard to know what that means, right? I mean, nothing exists independently of divine thought. The distinction between the three is generated by God himself in just the way that anything else is generated by God. So it's still, it's true, right? It's not a fiction anyway, I think.
That's good. We can just.
I mean, to think about I mentioned this a little bit in the paper. I mean, take a distinction like the distinction between me qua reasoner and me qua sentient being, for instance, right? I mean, that's a real distinction in me, I think. You have to, in order to understand what's going on when I perform abstraction or something, you've got to relate these two features of me, these two aspects of me, in certain ways. So I think these qua-objects, the distinction between them is often grounded in the thing itself and not merely superimposed upon it from the outside.
I definitely think that helps, and I do want to sort of give priority to Ryan and you guys' discussion, so I won't really push anything further. But Ryan, let's how about we go to the sort of second thing you want to touch on in this sort of worries section. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so the next one is just kind of like just in broad strokes, like compatibility with simplicity. Because so like divine simplicity and the Trinity, like, I mean, they're typically taken to be prima facie incompatible, which is why we're doing this episode. I mean, this complaint, comes from like medieval Jewish and Muslim thinkers, and then lots of contemporary Christian thinkers. And so the central question we're kind of getting at here is exactly how do you think you can reconcile simplicity and the Trinity? And you've given us this sort of broad outline, but here's some kind of things to tease it out a bit more. So on Robin, if I'm understanding your view properly here, like you're saying that divine persons are these qua-objects and they're grounded in these three distinct relational properties. But then you also say you're affirming this Augustinian Thomistic doctrine of simplicity. And when I look at people like Augustine, Catherine Rogers, James Dozel, Jeff Brower, Mike Bergman, lots of these other people, I mean, they're going to be saying that a simple God doesn't have any properties. And then Christopher Hughes says this is because anything you could count as a property is going to count as a part. So what I've got this claim that there's 3 relational properties, but then I've got this claim from all these people who are saying simplicity says no properties. So that seems like it looks like a direct contradiction here with simplicity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll have to double check this. I've often said that I affirm a strong doctrine of simplicity. I think I do, but it's not crazy strong. And it seems to me that what you're describing is a kind of crazy strong view, right? Where, I mean, for instance, suppose that I praise God today and then tomorrow I curse God. So now he's got 2 properties, right? Being praised by me one day and being cursed by me the other day. Does anybody really want to say those are exactly the same thing? I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. Mm-hmm. But of course, neither of them is an accident of God, inherent in God, right? Those are relational properties of God. So that seems fine. And then if that's possible, then why can't we talk about God's relations to himself, giving rise to similar relational sorts of properties without compromising his simplicity? That seems reasonable to me.
I mean, I think it's reasonable, but the problem is, like, the traditional doctrine is this crazy strong view. I mean, that's okay. The thing. So that's what's generating all these worries. Is not like a weaker view, because if you want to go to a weaker view, like, that's fine. Well, but if we're going to go with like a traditional,
maybe we should back up and think about why anyone wanted to believe something like a strong doctrine of simplicity, and then kind of sort out, which interpretation of it makes the most sense. I mean, it seems to me that a big part of it, of course, is that we want God to be an explanation stopper. We want God to be the first cause in such a way that once we reach him, we don't have to say, well, yeah, but why God? What made him? And the worry, of course, is that if God were metaphysically composite, so that he was built up out of various pieces, it looks as though then God's existence would somehow be dependent on those pieces existing, and maybe on their being put together in a certain way. And we could ask, well, what caused that? And then we don't seem to find God as an explanation stopper. So we want God to be simple in the sense that from a metaphysical point of view, there's no such internal complexity. But suppose that God, as a simple being, gives rise to complexity in the sense that the complexity is reducible to God as simple, right? So the derived properties that are multiple and complex, but are all grounded, to use that language, in God's simplicity. That seems to be fine, because that doesn't compromise his role as explanation stopper in any way. And that's the kind of complexity that I want to attribute to God here.
So I don't know what kind of complexity to give here, though, because it doesn't look anything remotely like what Augustine or Aquinas is going to give me. It looks more like maybe something like Scotus's view, which, again, like, I mean, I like Scotus because I'm in Scotland, so like, I kind of have to. Yeah. But a lot of Scotus scholars, like Richard Cross and Thomas Williams, are going to say it's not really simplicity; it's simplicity in name only.
Yeah, no, I'm not Scotus, certainly, because I mean, Scotus has multiple attributes of God that are not reducible to a single absolute simplicity, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the distinction. That's why I think Scotus is in trouble there. Whereas, and I actually think that my view is quite close to Augustine and Aquinas' view, in fact. I mean, look, they all say that there are 3 distinct persons in God. And so clearly they can't be claiming that there's no possible multiplicity in God of any kind. And much of what I'm doing is inspired really by Augustine's book in the Trinity, where he describes the Son as arising by virtue of being the perfect intentional object of God's self-knowledge, right? And that's really exactly what I'm trying to capture here. God knows himself. In knowing himself, there's an intentional object there. And that intentional object, in God's case, is God, right? It includes everything in God. And so that God qua-intentional object of that act of knowledge, that's the Son. That's the word in Augustine. And that's exactly what I'm saying. So I think it's pretty close to Augustine's picture.
I guess I'm worried it's not, and here's why. So in, was it 5.3 to 5.5 of Augustine's treatise on the Trinity, he says God doesn't have any properties. And what grounds the relations are these causal relations, and that's what's undergirding this whole idea of the subsistent relations, as he calls it. So and since you didn't want to go with the causal relations, which I understand because I don't either, because I'm like, it just looks exactly like the heresy to me. But Augustine's like, yeah, we have to affirm like what's called the a-causal, or the aseity of the Father, and he's the sole causal source of the Son and the Holy Spirit. Otherwise, we're going to have these three ultimate sources of reality, which is a very standard kind of claim from the Cappadocians. So
Yeah.
your view, like, it could be, maybe you could call it like a diet Augustinian, but like it's definitely not like the regular classic Augustinian.
Yeah. So why doesn't that view of Augustine give rise, though, to distinct properties in God? I mean, if
well, he
God,
doesn't want it to. It
Yeah.
might. But then we just say Augustine is just being inconsistent, and in which case then you could say, well, then I shouldn't be affirming an Augustinian view. I should affirm a consistent view that Augustine wanted
Right.
to affirm.
a cleaned up version of Augustine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Augustine sans inconsistencies or something.
Right.
That's
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
This might be a good place. Well, I just wanted to raise one question about maybe, but what Rob just sort of mentioned, that there's still this sort of singular, absolutely simple ground of this multiplicity in some sense. I'm wondering if there might be a sort of tu quoque objection on behalf of non-classical theists here in resisting the kind of aseity argument for divine simplicity. So they might say, as I think Matthew Badorf does in his 2016 paper, that well, if you guys as it were, I know I don't like speaking in tribal terms, but if you guys can use this sort of singular ground for multiplicity in this sort of sense, in some sense, well then surely the sort of non-classical theists can say that God as such is the ground of the multiplicity that divine simplicity proponents think is objectionable. So maybe God is this singular ground, like the being as such, or the supposit, right? The whole substance is sort of the ground of the distinct attributes or various parts in the sort of wide sense of part that thinkers in the sort of constituent ontology conceive of parts. So I'm wondering what you think about that tu quoque objection. And after we go through Rob on that point, then we can turn it over to Ryan for his next point.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting move. I actually haven't encountered that before. What was his name again? Matthew.
Matthew Badorf. I think it's Baddorf. I think it's his 2016 paper.
Okay.
It's something like Divine Simplicity
I should
Estate.
look that up. Yeah, I mean, maybe there's some kind of middle ground here that sort of reasonable versions of divine simplicity, like I endorse, and more reasonable non-classical versions here can converge upon. So, I mean, my worry, of course, is that if we take I guess a lot's going to turn on how we think of the grounding relation here. So the more, so to speak, the more unitive you think it to be, the closer to my position you are. The more causation-like you take it to be, the more you'll be in the non-classical kind of camp. But yeah, I mean, my worry there, I guess, if we take it in the more causation-like mode. So in other words, here's a possible non-classical picture, right? Okay, look, God the Father, that's the explanation stopper, right? And he's simple, right? And then he actually causes God the Son and God the Spirit eternally, right? Yeah, my worry there is more theological than metaphysical, I guess, right? It really does seem to me that it's quasi-Arian or something, right? That I don't see how, and then I don't really see how one could really call the Son the Spirit and the Spirit God in the fullest sense of the word in that case. I worry about that. Maybe there's also some metaphysical worries here too, that if, or maybe they're connected here. I mean, let's suppose then that there are three omnipotent beings, contrary to the Athanasian Creed, right? Two of whom are somehow caused by the first. Can the second and third really be omnipotent? I worry that that's impossible, right? Because, suppose that they decide let's call Abraham. No, let's not call Abraham, right? And so their wills clash. So there must be something that somehow ensures that all three wills are in lockstep with each other. Mm-hmm. Presumably that's the Father. And so now it looks as though the Son and Spirit aren't even really free beings, right? They're just projections of the Father's will. And so do we get three persons even anymore at that point? So those would be some of my worries off the top of my head. But I think it's a good suggestion, interesting suggestion to consider.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
no,
definitely.
I think those are good worries. I mean, I've written 3 different papers arguing exactly what you just laid out. Right. So, but it's again, like these are really the very deeply traditional view. One move that a classical Trinitarian is going to say in response to one of the claims you're going to make is, well, we don't want to say there are 3 wills in God. We want to say there's only one will, one mind and one will, and that's typically taken to be a very like broadly Latin sort of view. And so that's where like someone's going to push back. Not where I want to push back, because I want to be like, no, give me 3 wills, give me 3 minds, but for the Trinity.
Right.
Well, I think, Brian, let's go on to, I just really wanted to see what he might think of that tu quoque. So exactly, it does look like there are some interesting things to explore there, but let's turn to what you want to cover next, Ryan, for your next sort of worry or objection.
Yeah, so in your paper, you say like you could have the divine nature be an essence, you could like a universal or a trope, and then you just kind of decide you're going to lay out the trope view. And so there's this quote from William Hasker's book on the Trinity that I found really interesting. I was kind of curious what you think about it. So like a trope, for everybody listening here, it's like supposed to be like an instance of a property that's not shareable. So like maybe like a particular apple's like redness or something like that. And so here's this quote from Hasker. So Hasker says, if we view the divine essence as concrete, as a trope, then it is not shareable as between the divine persons. Each would need to have his own trope, and we would not, after all, have a single divine essence, as all the pro-Nicenes insisted that we must. So that's that Hasker quote. So just kind of, what do you think about this idea here, like this objection from Hasker?
Yeah, right. So, I think that my pushback to Hasker would be to say, well, if you think of the divine essence as a shareable universal, and each of the 3 persons are instances of it, then you're a tritheist. You've got 3 distinct gods, and I think that's a really problematic view. So my view is that there's just one instance of the divine essence, namely itself, and that gives rise to 3 persons who are grounded in that one essence. So, and I sort of explain how qua-objects inherit the core essential properties of their ground. And so in that sense, the Father, Son, and Spirit are participating in the divine essence, but not by being distinct instances of it, but rather as being that instance qua this or that relational property.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I'm following this. So it's not that there are 3 things, I guess just for lack of a better word, that are sharing this trope, but the trope is grounding the 3 persons.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that helps get some clarity on this issue. Yeah. Joe, do you want to go on to the next one here?
Yeah, sure, definitely. Take it away, Ryan.
Okay, so yeah. So the next worry we had is about these persons as relations, or these relational objects.
Yeah.
So I'm a bit worried that this view is not really plausible here, because it seems that this view is not really like this view of like a divine person as a qua-object that's not analogous to what we use as a person in other contexts. And if it's not analogous, then it seems like it's going to be equivocal, and then that seems like that's going to go against, even justifiably saying that there are persons in the Trinity. So here's the way to kind of state the objection. So you've got a divine person as a qua-object, but it seems like you also want to say that a person in most cases is not a qua-object, because when you give these examples of like Trump or Obama, qua this or qua that, you say, well, those aren't persons. Because you say like Obama or Trump, like they actually give rise to qua-objects. And so that seems like it presupposes that a person is more fundamental than qua-objects. And so given that, then like I don't understand exactly how I could say that a person in the case of the Trinity is a qua-object, since I don't want to say it in the case of anything else. And then it's not univocal, it's not analogical, and it looks like that's just equivocation.
Yeah. Okay, good. So a couple of responses here. One would be, look, in a sense, Trump qua president is a person, right? I mean, is Trump qua president a human being? Well, yeah, right. Because only human beings can be president. So,
Mhm.
so he's a human being. Is he a center of consciousness and so on? Yes. So the qua-objects are literally persons, even in the ordinary created case. Now, of course, as I point on the paper, in the case of something like Trump qua president, it's it's incomplete in a radical sort of way, leaves out an awful lot of what would be required to be, which word I want to put here, a metaphysically complete person. Let's put it that way, right? And so that's why it makes sense if Trump walks in the room to say, look, there's one person in the room, not 7 or 8 or whatever. I don't count the different qua-objects because they fall so far short of metaphysical completeness, let's say. Now, in the case of God, on the other hand, when God knows himself, he knows himself perfectly and exhaustively, right? So God qua known is just, it includes all of God, right? And so it's just as personal, from a metaphysical point of view, just as fully a person as it could be. And so that's why these qua-objects in that case count as persons. So I want to say it's perfectly analogous to persons in the human case. And the persons are thinkers and willers and lovers and so on. And they are metaphysically complete. They include all of the divine essence.
Okay, that actually gets us to the very next worry that I've got, which is about these qua-objects as complete and like standalone substances.
Yeah.
So like you just said, like in the case of humans, like these qua-objects cannot count as like complete, like functioning persons.
Yeah.
So I guess I feel like then I've got this idea of person a bit left undefined here. So you allude in the paper, you allude to this idea that like a person is supposed to be like a standalone substance in some sort of sense. But if that's what it takes to be a complete person, then it's, then I can easily see why Trump cannot count as a complete person, like the qua-objects of Trump. Like Trump qua president's not going to count as a person because you can't find Trump qua president floating free from just Donald Trump.
Right.
But I think that's also going to demonstrate that why a qua-object in the case of God cannot be a divine person either, because on the doctrine of the Trinity, it's typically said it's impossible for any member of the Trinity to exist as a standalone substance. And this is what's typically called the doctrine of perichoresis. Yeah. So if that's the case, then if there are qua-objects of God, they cannot be persons because they can't be these standalone objects.
Right. Yeah, so the standalone point is, I think, not the central question. It was something I was using to illustrate the kind of metaphysical incompleteness I was talking about. So in other words, when a creaturely entity is sort of incomplete, one way to see that is to see that it couldn't stand alone. Now, the 3 persons, it's true that it's possible for them to stand alone, but not because of there's some kind of deficiency in any one of them or incompleteness or something that the other 2 have to make up. That's not so there's a completely different account there of their non-standaloniness, right? Okay. As you would find in the case of Obama or Trump qua hotel owner or something like that. So the point is that Trump qua hotel owner just let's see, it leaves out so much of what Trump thinks or does or says or is, right? That we couldn't think of it as a complete person in some sense, but God qua known by God doesn't leave out anything at all, and so there's no reason why that can't count as a full person in a strong sense.
Joe, do you have any follow-up questions on that before I go on to the next? Because I think that kind of leads into the next objection.
Yeah, I'll save some of my stuff for later on if we have any time. So definitely bleed into your next one.
Okay. So I want to get into this worry about how to distinguish the divine persons.
Yeah.
So earlier you said, we've got these 3 qua-objects. And so you said the Father is God qua knower, like the knower of God. And then the Son is God qua known by God. And then the Holy Spirit is God like a qua both knower and known by God.
Yeah.
And so I the objection is that like I think it fails to distinguish the divine persons, because one of the underlying claims within classical doctrine of divine simplicity and classical theism as a whole is that like God's knowledge is self-knowledge, and that he's identical to that self-knowledge. And so if that's true, then the Father is known by God, in which case the Father is God qua known by God, and from which it follows that the Father and Son are both God qua known by God, and then you've just lost the distinction between the Father and the Son, and so then you violated the doctrine of the Trinity. That's the objection in a nutshell.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Good. So let's see. So these qua-objects, they are going to have certain properties. I mean, let's just take the kind of ordinary case again. Trump qua hotel owner, or something like that, right? So that's going to have certain properties that Trump has and not have other properties that Trump has, right? But it's not going to have only the property of owning a hotel. It's going to have all kinds of other properties that are compatible with being a hotel owner, so to speak, or that flow from it or connect with it in relevant sorts of ways. So maybe being a billionaire might be one of the properties that Trump qua hotel owner would have, or being the employer of many workers or something like that, right? So just because God is God the Father is God qua knower, or God the Son is God qua known, doesn't mean that they can't also, that God the Father can't be known, or that God the Son can't know. They can. But that doesn't obliterate the distinction between the two, right? Because they're still defined in terms of distinct properties of God, knowing versus being known. And as I explained in the paper, the qualifications ramify into the verbs as well. So yes, God qua Son knows God, but he knows God qua being known by. So the knowing itself is qualified by his status as the Word of God, so to speak. And similarly, God qua the Father is known by the Son, let's say. But again, it's the Son is going to know the God the Father qua one who's known, right? And the fact that the Father is known is not incompatible with his being the knower, right? Being sort of essentially, or not essentially, being by definition the knower. So anyway, I know that's a little confusing, but my point is that the fact that God qua knower is known is compatible with my view. There's nothing that contradicts that. And in fact, God qua knower is going to have all of the sort of first order properties of God, right? So is God the knower, and so on. All three persons will have all of those properties, but they'll have them each in a somewhat different way, so to speak, in a qualified way, qualified by their particular status.
Could you restate what that difference is? So we want to say all the divine persons are known by God, but you want to say that they're each known in a qualified way. Could you restate what that is? Just because I feel like I missed it.
Yeah. So in other words, the thought is that the verb knowing here can also be qualified, right? So it could be unqualified too. So God the Son knows God the Father. That's true, right? It's also true that God the Son knows qua the Son, the Father. That is, his knowing is a kind of sonly knowing of the Father. And if I ask, well, does God the Father know qua Son, the Son, or the Father himself? No. God the Father doesn't know qua the Son anything, right? That would be incompatible, right, with his being God qua knower. But just being known, that's compatible with being God qua knower, right? Likewise, knowing is compatible with being God qua known. But there are different qualifications of knowing, right, that then distinguish between the three persons on this picture.
Okay, so it sounds like then that what's distinguishing the persons really isn't God qua knower, it's something else, because they're all known. So the Son has a particular kind of way of being known. The Father has a particular kind of way of being known. So it seems like there's something more fundamental then than the qualifications you had laid out of how to distinguish the persons.
Yeah.
So you see what I'm saying?
Let's go. I mean, it's like Trump again. So let's suppose that Trump, qua billionaire, is a hotel owner, and Trump, qua hotel owner, is a billionaire. think that's probably true. Okay, that doesn't collapse the distinction between the two. There's still a difference between being a hotel owner and being a billionaire, right? And so there are two different distinct qua-objects there as well. Likewise, there's a difference between being the knower and being known, and that's enough to ground two distinct qua-objects, even if they have all the same first-order properties, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I can explain why I'm missing this. So here's why I'm missing this. When I look at the case of Trump, I want to say, Trump qua hotel owner and Trump qua president. I'm like, well, there's just one person there, and that one person is more fundamental than these qua-objects, because these qua-objects are just Trump having certain properties. And I can't transfer this over to the Trinity because I don't have one fundamental person. These qua-objects are supposed to give me the persons. So that's where I think I'm struggling.
Yeah,
with.
I mean, it raises an interesting question, really, which is whether on my view, I don't get four persons instead of three, right? That is, isn't just God simpliciter a person as well? And so don't I get four persons? And here, this is where I say, well, okay, I guess I do. But I'll fall back on the idea that, person in the creeds is a kind of technical term, right? So it means one of these three that aren't just God simpliciter. But yeah, strictly speaking, I think I get four persons. So that's potentially a problem.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the difference is that the fourth person isn't distinct from the other three in the same way that the three are distinct from each other. Right? I want to say that the three are really distinct from each other, whereas none of them is really distinct from God's simpliciter. So that would be my claim, to be able to say legitimately there are exactly three persons, in a sense.
Okay. So, Joe, the other questions I had were all about these causal relations, but since Rob doesn't want to go down that road, which I understand because I don't either, why don't we look at some of the objections that you were going to raise?
Yeah, well, I've actually thought of maybe two of them that I didn't put in the document, but Rob does sort of address one of them in his discussion, or in his paper. And I know I'm sensitive of the time. The recording, we're about 1 minute and 7 minutes, or 1 hour and 7 minutes through. That was a rough that was a rough speaking job. But anyway, so maybe just about 15 more minutes, and then we can close this out.
Okay.
And so the two, one of the benefits of your count, Rob, was that it helps give a sort of account of why it is just three, right? Three and only three, right? Persons in the Godhead. And so I'm wondering if you can speak. There are two related points that one might sort of challenge with respect to your account and how it explains how it's, why there are just three. So one of them is actually one that you address in your paper, and so you're definitely going to be prepared for this, but it's sort of about the worry about generating infinitely many hypostases, right? So according to your account, we have this. The divine nature is essentially it's like a relation. It's a relational nature, knowledge and love, and of course those are identical with one another. And so we could just represent that as R, right? And so we have this relational nature, and because God knows Himself, loves Himself fully, there's sort of this self-intentional knowledge. It's sort of it's a relation that bears itself to itself. So R stands in R to R, right? So then the schema is R, 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 right? And so that is sort of helping us generate, as it were, giving rise to the three divine persons. But I'm wondering, like someone might be thinking, like, well, if it's in the very nature of R to be self-intentional in this kind of way, then one might think that this would equally apply to these relata once they're generated by that first iteration, right? So one might think that because it's of the very nature of that R to be self-intentional or to be applying to itself, R stands in R to R, we might worry that this would, sort of generate, as it were, or give rise to like R, 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 right? So then 9, and then we sort of reiterate it and keep on doing that. So I know you touch on this in the paper, but I did want the audience to just be aware of this sort of worry, and I did want you to be able to sort of touch on it here. So what are you thinking about that?
Yeah, so I guess one of the worries would be that the quas, can be extended infinitely long. So not just God qua knower, but God qua knower, qua known. and or God qua-knower, 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 and so on, right? Why don't I get an infinite number of distinct qua-objects there? So my thought is, let's see if I can try to see if I can find the passage where I talk about this in the paper. But my thought is that those other qua-objects will collapse into the three, or they'll just be excluded because there's something incoherent about them. So, so for instance, for God to know something qua-knower makes sense, but for him to know it qua-knower, but then and not qua-known, but also qua-known and not qua-knower, right? That would just be a clash. That would be an incoherent kind of a property, and so we could exclude that. Whereas if it's just God qua-knower, 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 just keep piling them on. That's just the same thing as God qua-knower. You haven't really introduced a new property. So the thought is either you get redundancy, in which case it collapses back into one of the three, or you get inconsistency of some kind, in which case the property doesn't make any sense. So you don't get a qua-object there either. I think that's the story I've told.
Yeah. No, that it does seem to make sense, but I do worry. I might sort of worry about whether or not there is that sort of inconsistency there, because it's not as though we are simultaneously affirming that that one thing, this like numerically one thing, is both God qua-known and God qua-not known, like / God qua-knower, right? But rather it's like it's a double iteration of the quas on the exact same thing, and I don't know. It's not clear to me that it's a sort of clear contradiction, right? Because it's not as though we're saying that God is, or that this thing is God qua-knower and God qua-not knower, or like God qua-known, but rather it's like God qua-knower, qua-known. It's like a sort of further modification of it. I'm not sure if it sort of contradicts it, but it's sort of a further modification of that qua-object. It's just that qua-object qua some other respect. So I don't know. I'm explaining it horribly, but that's because
No, you're explaining it pretty well, actually.
Let me try to take another crack at this. So so you've got God qua-known, and so you're like, okay, well, that's the Father. And then qua this other thing, that's the Son. Well, then it seems like there's something to say that there's something that there's something that is like for the Father to know the Son, and for the Son to know the Father, and for the Holy Spirit to know, and so on. And those are new qua-objects. And then it's also there's another qua-object, which is the three divine persons being known by God together, and the three of them knowing God. Right? And so then you can start multiplying a bunch of these different ways, and those do seem like different qua-objects now.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the question is whether the, let's see, whether the attacking the qua-known onto the end doesn't, in effect, cancel, either clashes with or cancels the inner qualifications in such a way that you just get back to the Son again. Because after all, the Father is God, right? And so if you tack qua-known onto that, I think I'd argue that you in effect cancel the paternity there and gotten back to the Son again. But yeah, I mean, I agree. Admittedly, that's it is definitely a potential worry, I think, for the account, and one that I would want to keep working on.
Yeah, definitely. No, and I really like how this is sort of like, it's like a constructive endeavor, right? Like, you're not saying that this is like orthodoxy. You're not saying that this is like, in fact, definitely the case. Like, we're sort of exploring this together. We're probing this together, which is so interesting. It's so cool. It's like we're on the sort of edge of our thinking. And so another one problem that this is one of them that I didn't include in the document, but I'm wondering, like, why isn't it just 2 hypostases instead of 3, right? Because you have the Spirit as a sort of conjunction, like qua-knower and known. But like, why are we allowed to do that? Like, why don't we just have the Father and the Son, like God qua-known and God qua-knower? Why is there this further conjunction of the two? Like, why don't we also have further conjunctions or like further disjunctions? Like, I was kind of wondering that as I read the paper. I mean, maybe it was sort of misplaced, but I definitely was wondering, like, why we're allowed to get this conjunction in there. Like, why isn't it just the Father and the Son, and we only have 2 hypostases? It's just God qua-known and God qua-knower. It's like, once you allow in this logical construction of the and, I'm wondering how you debar further logical constructions. So yeah, maybe you can touch on that.
Right, right. So, yeah, so for instance, why not God qua knower or known, right? Why not a disjunction, right? And my thought there again has to do with the nature of grounding. So that's going to be grounded either in God knowing or in God not knowing, and so or God being known. And so it doesn't really introduce a further qua-object. I'm not quite sure. That is, whereas the conjunction does, because the conjunction is not going to be grounded either by the one or by the other, right? It's going to have its own. I mean, it's been grounded by both of them together, but that's just the point, right? That's why the Spirit is distinct from either the Father or the Son, taken individually.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. So I guess there might be sort of different questions that we can disentangle here, but one of them is like, why do we get this extra conjunction? Like, I get that we might have the conjuncts, but like, why can we? This is a bad phrase, but why can we help ourselves to this conjunction? Why don't we? Like, how does your account allow us to get that and not just stop at the God qua knower and God qua known with just two hypostases?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's easier in a way to justify that than it is to explain why you don't get all the other things, right? So I mean, if Trump's a president and a billionaire, we could think about what's true about Trump qua billionaire and president, qua billionaire president, right? And there are some features that will be uniquely true of him under that guise that weren't true under either of the two individually. So I think the conjunction is not so much a problem as explaining why you don't get all the other logically complex operators.
Yeah, like further conjunction.
There, I think you'd have to. Well, right. So you know, I mean, you could do P and Q and P again, right? But then that's just going to be logically equivalent to P and Q, so you haven't really gone anywhere, right? And you could go P and Q or P, but now you're just referring disjunctively either to the Father or to the Spirit, right? You're not really introducing a new. There's no new ground that's needed at that point, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So
No.
The hope is that working this out ground theoretically will give us, you know, all of this grounded in God's simpliciter, but just three nodes that are needed beyond that. That's the hope.
Yeah, well, Ryan, if you're okay with me sort of going with a little bit further problems that I might raise. So one thing, well, this might be just a quote-unquote problem for classical theism as such, but I'm wondering if you, Rob, think that there might be certain paradoxes of self-reference looming here. So like, you know, like God knows himself, but like God is simultaneously identical to that very act of knowledge by which he knows himself. So we have this sort of self-referential knowledge or self-intentional knowledge, like God's act of knowledge. God is not only the object of it, but he's also identical to that very act. So I know not all self-reference is paradoxical, right? Like you know, I can say like some of the things that Joe says are true. Like, you know, that's self-referential and it seems benign. But I'm wondering if you think that we have we might have certain paradoxes of self-reference that crop up here, or whether this might be in conflict with like a simple solution to all self-reference paradoxes, just to ban self-reference altogether. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, so in an earlier life, I did a lot on the liar paradox. Actually, my first book was on the liar-related paradoxes, and I would definitely say we don't want to ban all self-reference. That would be a bad way to go. There are lots of cases of for a big part of that book was dealing with things like game theory, where you're interacting with people, and there's lots of self-reference there. That is, I know that you know that I know that we all know this stuff, right? And there's something inherently self-referential about that, and yet you actually get different results in game theory depending upon whether you assume that kind of mutual knowledge or you don't. So it's actually pretty important. So yeah, I don't want to ban self-knowledge, and it's an interesting question. I mean, I haven't thought of any way in which the Trinity might rise to something like a paradox, but I'll give it some thought. I mean, usually in this context, you know, there's been this argument that omniscience is paradoxical.
Yeah, like the Russellian paradox.
Yeah, exactly, like the Appendix B paradox and things like that. And there, my view is that, you know, that really requires working out your theory of propositions correctly. So in this particular case, you know, it's well, I mean, I guess I guess one could think about how to translate the kind of knowledge I'm talking about into propositions. But I've been thinking of it primarily in a kind of non-propositional way.
Mm-hmm.
I think God just sort of knows himself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the object is a thing, right, himself, and not some set of propositions.
Okay. Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. So one last question, and then we won't really go back and forth on this because this will just be the last thing to sort of before the concluding remarks. But I did want to just ask, this was definitely one on the document, but like we might think that there's a sort of paradox looming around here, and it's that like surely the Godhead has the divine nature, as it were, or is the divine nature, or what have you. And we might think that, it is essentially Trinitarian. Like the Godhead as such is essentially Trinitarian.
Yeah.
Like Trinitarian in the sense of like having three hypostases, or however we want to phrase it. But then we might think that anything, because the Godhead as such has a divine nature, which is Trinitarian, we might think that anything with that identical, that very same nature would thereby be Trinitarian as well, because whatever's, we might think that if two things have one and the same nature, they have all the same essential properties because it's one and the same thing. We might think that. And so that might seem to entail that each of the hypostases is Trinitarian, which we don't want that because they definitely don't have further hypostases intrinsic to them or what have you. So I'm wondering, this will just close us off. I'll just get your quick thoughts on that, and then we'll sort of turn it over to the concluding remarks.
Yeah. No, you're right. And actually, the Athanasian Creed explicitly talks about this, right? There's one Father, not three fathers, and one Son, not three sons, because they're worried about that very kind of ramification. So I think the theory of qua-objects maybe helps here, because we can make a distinction between those properties which will be inherited by the qua-objects from their base and those that aren't. And so, for instance, not being a qua-object, right? That's clearly something that God's simpliciter has and that the three qua-objects couldn't possibly have. And so, and yet, is God's simpliciter in some sense essentially not a qua-object? Well, yeah, right? I mean, in the sense that in every possible world, necessarily, it's not a qua-object. But that's not essential to God in the way that's intended, I think, here. That is, there are certain properties that are, I think in the paper I described them as like first order properties or something like that. Properties that aren't defined in terms of the logical machinery that we built up here in order to explain the Trinity. And so those sort of properties go through to the three persons, but not being a Trinity. That gets blocked.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ryan, I didn't mean to like sort of exclude you from the conversation for this last bit, but any non-question related concluding remarks from Ryan, from you, or either of you before I give mine?
I guess so. When I was going into this, I was thinking I want to consider like the really strong traditional doctrine of divine simplicity, and then the really conciliar Trinitarian understanding, and see how do they fit together. And it's what I'm leaving this conversation with is they don't, because we're gonna have to do something with the Trinity on the one hand, and then do something with simplicity on the other. So if you really do want something in the neighborhood of simplicity and conciliar Trinitarianism, you have to do some modifications somewhere, which I'm happy with that, because I think we need to do modifications anyway within the doctrine of God, within theology.
Yeah, good. Can I chime in then?
Yeah,
I
definitely.
think it's been a really, really a helpful conversation, and appreciate the time that y'all put into it and the feedback. And it's been constructive, as you said. I mean, I've learned from it. I hope you've learned from me, and we can all go back and do some even better work on it.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll talk to the audience now. So, I absolutely love this. This was wonderful, very enlightening. Unfortunately, like this is kind of like way into the weeds of theology and philosophy. So it was difficult to follow at times for well, I know for a lot of people, including myself, of course. But I definitely enjoyed it so much, and thank you both for coming on. Just thank you so much. And for everyone else, I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.